Okay, so I've been studying the story of Job. And the story of Job is the story of suffering.
Yes,
Okay.
and meaningless, right.
Right,
What
right.
seems like random events, right.
Or worse than random, malevolent.
Malevolent, that's right.
So worse than random. Okay, so this is how the story sets itself up. So we're told at the beginning of the story that Job is a good man. And we have the testimony of God himself on Job's account. And so God is up in heaven, bragging away, so to speak, about how good Job is. And his sons come to observe, and one of whom is Satan. And Satan says, I don't think Job's that good. I think he's just fortunate. And God says, no, I think he's good. And Satan says, why don't you let me have a crack at him and we'll see if he's good. And so God says, yeah, okay, do your worst. And in consequence, and that's the malevolent element, let's say, at least the arbitrary element, but perhaps the malevolent element, Job loses everything that he's worked for, virtually everything he works for. He loses much of his family. He becomes very ill, and not just ill, but ill in a way that's disfiguring and shameful. And then his friends come along, and tell him that, well, if he had been a better guy, none of this would have happened. So really, it's his fault. And then Job has a response, and this is why I'm bringing up this story. Job's response is to insist that despite proximal evidence, it's a requirement to maintain faith in the essential goodness of the individual, especially an individual who's been conducting himself ethically, which Job has been, by his own testimony, and by God's testimony. We know Job is a good man. And Job's wife tells him when she observes his suffering, she says, there's nothing left for you to do but shake your fist at God, curse him, and die. And Job says instead, and he insists this to his friends, he refuses to lose faith in his essential goodness, and he also refuses to lose faith in the essential goodness of God. And it's something like this, and this is what's relevant to the shattered assumptions notion, is that in order to stabilize the structure through which you view the world, it is necessary to adopt as axiomatic the notion that whatever happens to you if you conduct yourself ethically is the best thing that could happen, regardless of the proximal evidence. And also, it's necessary for you not to lose faith in the essential goodness of being itself. And those are religious proclamations, right? They're proclamations of a kind of religious faith.
Right. That's right.
Well, and it seems to me too
and tall orders at that, right?
Oh God, the tallest. In fact, the tallest of orders. Exactly. Because it's interesting, because the book of Job is one of the books that really sets the stage in the biblical corpus for the story of the crucifixion, right? Because the crucifixion story is the story of Job expanded even more thoroughly. Right. Now, these shattered assumptions that you describe, they seem to me to be identical to axioms of faith, conceptually speaking. Right? They're a priori commitments.
Except, yes, at some level, except, they developed, the way we need to think about them is these develop from early infancy, from childhood.
Yeah.
I mean, they're based in, it's not like somebody's taking a leap of faith. Faith is based on, you don't need sort of, their validity in the world is irrelevant. Do you know? That's what faith is about, right? Things don't have to, there's no proof, right? You take a leap, an act of faith. These are fundamental beliefs based on experience. They're not just, sort of pie in the sky. They're not things that, I want to believe that. These are not desires. They're based on, let's say, the infant who is getting good enough parenting, not great parenting, good enough parenting, realizes the world is predictable. The child cries, the mother, the father come and help. The world becomes meaningful, becomes benevolent. It's a good world. I'm getting fed. I must be worth something. I mean, these are very, rudimentary kind of beliefs, but it starts there and it builds. And, what comes first obviously gets confirmed. I do think, though you were calling them naive, at one level, it's what allows us to wake up in the morning and approach the day, okay?
Yeah,
And
assuming
the-
our
and the fact-
assumptions haven't been shattered.
That haven't been shattered. That's right. But even if they have been shattered, what is also important to recognize is people that started with these positive assumptions actually do better in coping with the shattered beliefs because they actually have something to kind of move back to. Okay. If you start with very negative beliefs about the world, if you start with, you are going to be more prone to possibly a realistic view of the world being bad, if that's what, when bad things do happen in the world, right? To good people, right? Bad things happen to good people. Then nevertheless, you are going to be more prone to depression and anxiety. Just, living in the world is harder. So some of these, what seem like illusory beliefs are what allow us to be. You talked about motivation. It allows us to be motivated on a daily basis to function and operate and, love and care. And, so I do think, and they have long-term consequences when bad things happen. Because what happens after the shattering is people try to rebuild these assumptions. In the best cases, and by the way, most cases, not the cases that all go to psychologists and whatever. If you did huge community surveys, which we did, you find lots of people have gone through some really horrible things and don't necessarily go to a clinician. Now everybody goes to clinicians. 30, 40 years ago, that wasn't the case. People coped. They did well. No, they had people who cared around them. Their own sort of internal worlds allowed them to try to deal. One thing that I found that was fascinating, for example, is that self-blame was remarkably common after all of these things. Even when I did some work with people who are paraplegics or quadriplegics from being shot randomly on the street or truly random events. You and I would unquestionably call random for the victim. And these people would still engage in some self-blame. Now, why? It's not, and by the way, the only literature that talked about self-blame were rape victims, because everybody was blaming the women anyway, right? Which was, just because victims blame themselves doesn't mean they're blameworthy, okay? So why? Why blame? Why engage in this in ways that seem inappropriate given the true situation? It's because that allowed people to get some sense of control, to start believing the world isn't random, to start believing the world is not as bad as they thought, taking some of the blame on themselves. Now, the sad part of that is, of course, other people could then blame them more if they were blaming themselves, when that is not appropriate or legitimate. But what we do in terms of our own coping, I think, is really kind of fascinating. And that was something that was surprising to me, seeing all this self-blame. But there are lots of other ways people coped. They think of worst cases. But people would, sort of try to rebuild assumptions. Of course, initially, there's a lot of numbing, and people can't kind of deal with the situation. But over time, you get all the intrusive thoughts, right? Not the denial, but the intrusive thoughts when you're ready to work on it. And our brains, our human species systems are remarkable at working on things that need to be solved, even when we're not consciously doing it, right? And over time, what I found is people did remarkably well. That doesn't mean they rarely return to the same, as you would say, naive assumptions, but they turn to more positive assumptions about the world and were sadder but wiser.